Tensions between Washington and Ottawa have always existed beneath the surface, but what unfolded in this latest chapter has sent political shockwaves far beyond North America. What we are witnessing is not just another diplomatic disagreement. It is a moment that could redefine how two of the world's closest allies negotiate power, sovereignty, and leverage in an era where political strongmen and economic pressure tactics dominate global headlines. The confrontation did not begin with raised voices. It began with positioning. For months, friction had been quietly building between the administration in Washington and leadership in Ottawa. Trade disagreements, energy policy clashes, border management disputes, and differing approaches to international alliances created a backdrop of unease. Publicly, both sides maintained the language of partnership. Privately, officials on both ends signaled frustration. Then came the moment that changed the tone entirely. Standing before reporters, cameras flashing and microphones stretched forward, Mark Carney delivered what many are now calling one of the boldest statements ever issued by a Canadian leader toward the United States. His message was firm, it was calculated, and it was unmistakably direct. Canada, he declared, would not bend. The statement was framed not as aggression, but as necessity. Carney outlined what he described as a pattern of pressure tactics from Washington, policies and rhetoric that, in his view, crossed a line. He emphasized that Canada values its partnership with the United States deeply, but partnership does not mean submission. Cooperation does not mean concession without limits. The ultimatum was clear. If certain policies were not reconsidered, Canada would respond with measures designed to protect its economic and strategic interests. These measures, according to insiders, were not symbolic gestures. They were substantial enough to cause real economic and political consequences. The room fell silent as the implications settled in. For years, the United States and Canada have maintained one of the most integrated economic relationships in the world. Billions of dollars in goods cross the border daily. Supply chains are deeply intertwined. Energy infrastructure links provinces to states. Defense cooperation stretches back decades. The idea of serious disruption to this relationship is not something policymakers treat lightly, yet Carney's tone suggested that Canada was prepared for escalation if necessary. Across the border, the reaction from Washington was swift but measured. Officials close to President Donald Trump signaled frustration, describing the ultimatum as unnecessary and confrontational. Privately, some advisors reportedly viewed it as a political maneuver designed to strengthen Carney's standing domestically. But others in the White House recognized something different. They saw resolve. Trump himself has built much of his political brand on negotiation through strength. His administration has repeatedly used tariffs, trade renegotiations, and direct rhetoric to extract concessions from allies and rivals alike. This strategy has often forced counterparts into defensive positions. What made this situation different was that Canada did not retreat. Carney's response effectively flipped the script. Rather than reacting to Washington's pressure, he applied his own. He reframed the dynamic from one where Canada was responding to U.S. initiatives to one where Canada was drawing a firm boundary. The phrase "red line" began circulating almost immediately in political commentary. Behind the scenes, diplomats scrambled. Emergency consultations were held between senior officials. Economic advisors ran projections. Business leaders expressed concern about potential fallout. Markets watched closely, sensitive to any hint of instability in one of the world's most significant bilateral trade relationships. At stake is more than a policy disagreement. It is a test of how middle powers assert themselves in an increasingly transactional global environment. Carney's supporters argue that this was long overdue. They say Canada has too often absorbed pressure quietly in the name of preserving harmony. They point to previous disputes over lumber, steel, energy pipelines, and regulatory standards, where compromises were made under intense U.S. pressure. In their view, drawing a line now sends a message not only to Washington, but to the world. Canada is prepared to defend its autonomy, even when dealing with its most powerful ally. Critics, however, warn that ultimatums can corner both sides. They argue that diplomacy functions best when flexibility is preserved. Public declarations, especially those framed in uncompromising terms, reduce the room for quiet negotiation. Once leaders stake reputations on firmness, backing down becomes politically costly. Inside Washington, political calculations are equally complex. President Trump thrives on displays of dominance. Being perceived as yielding to pressure from an ally could undermine that image among his base. Yet escalating a dispute with Canada carries its own risks. Economic blowback, criticism from U.S. industries dependent on cross-border trade, and potential strain within NATO and other cooperative frameworks. The energy sector looms particularly large in this confrontation. Canada remains one of the United States' largest energy suppliers. Any disruption to energy flows would ripple through markets. Similarly, U.S. agricultural exports rely heavily on Canadian markets. Tariff escalation in either direction would not be contained neatly within national borders. It would spill into communities on both sides. Observers have begun drawing parallels to past trade showdowns, but this moment feels different. The rhetoric is sharper. The geopolitical climate is more polarized. Domestic politics in both countries are more volatile than in previous decades. For Carney, the calculus may also include internal political considerations. Standing firm against Washington can galvanize national unity. Historically, Canadian leaders who adopt a strong stance in defense of sovereignty often see short-term boosts in approval ratings. National identity in Canada is frequently defined in contrast to the United States. A public assertion of independence resonates deeply, but political capital is not infinite. If economic consequences follow, public opinion can shift quickly. Businesses facing tariffs, workers fearing layoffs, and investors watching volatility may pressure the government to seek compromise. The White House faces similar domestic constraints. American manufacturers dependent on Canadian inputs would likely resist prolonged conflict. Governors of border states, whose economies are closely tied to Canada, could become vocal critics of escalation. What makes this standoff especially consequential is timing. Global supply chains are already under stress. Geopolitical tensions elsewhere demand coordination among Western allies. A fracture between Washington and Ottawa would be strategically inconvenient at best, destabilizing at worst. In his remarks, Carney was careful to leave a narrow opening for dialogue. He emphasized that Canada prefers negotiation over confrontation. The ultimatum was framed as conditional, not absolute. This nuance may prove crucial in the days ahead. Diplomacy often operates in layers. Public statements serve one audience. Private conversations serve another. It is possible that even as headlines describe humiliation and shock, back-channel discussions are exploring off-ramps. Still, the symbolism cannot be ignored. When a Canadian leader speaks in terms that suggest readiness to retaliate against the United States, it signals a shift in tone. For decades, the relationship has been characterized by quiet pragmatism. Disagreements occurred, but they were usually managed through institutional mechanisms and incremental compromise. Now the language is sharper, the stakes more visible. International observers are watching closely. Allies in Europe and Asia see this as a case study in how the United States manages relationships with partners. If Canada, one of its closest allies, feels compelled to issue an ultimatum, what does that signal to others navigating similar pressures? At the same time, some analysts argue that this confrontation could ultimately strengthen the relationship. Moments of tension can clarify expectations. Clear boundaries can prevent future misunderstandings. If both sides emerge with a recalibrated understanding of mutual respect, the alliance may prove more resilient. The coming days will be critical. Negotiators must balance firmness with flexibility. Political leaders must weigh rhetoric against consequence. Markets will respond to signals of either escalation or compromise. For now, one thing is undeniable. The dynamic has shifted. Carney's statement transformed what might have remained a technical policy dispute into a defining political moment. Trump's response, measured but firm, ensures that neither side can easily retreat without explanation. This is not merely about one ultimatum. It is about power, leverage, and the evolving nature of alliances in a world where national interests are asserted more openly than ever before. As citizens watch, debate, and speculate, the deeper question remains: is this the beginning of a prolonged confrontation or a dramatic negotiation tactic designed to reset the table? History suggests that the United States and Canada share too many interests to allow permanent rupture. Geography alone makes cooperation inevitable. Economic interdependence reinforces that reality. Security partnerships demand coordination. Yet history also shows that alliances endure only when both sides feel respected. In drawing a line, Carney has signaled that respect must be mutual. In refusing to be dismissed, Washington signals that strength remains central to its posture. Somewhere between those positions lies the path forward. The tension in the air today may ultimately give way to renewed negotiation tomorrow, or it may harden into a more competitive dynamic that reshapes North American politics for years to come. For now, the world watches as two neighboring nations, bound by trade, history, and shared values, navigate one of their most consequential diplomatic tests in recent memory. Whatever happens next, this moment will be remembered as the point when the conversation changed.